Dobroveče i dobrodošli na još jedan Filozofski teatar. Na početku bih htela tradicionalno da se zahvalim Narodnom pozorištu u Beogradu i svim ljudima koji rade u organizaciji i pripremi Filozofskog teatra. Zaista im hvala, rade užasno veliki posao i posebno želim da se zahvalim Željku Hubaču, direktoru drame Narodnog pozorišta u Beogradu, koji je uopšte omogućio da se ovaj projekat pokrene i naravno Ivani Nenadović, bez koje Filozofski teatar ne bi postojao uopšte. I naravno Srećku Horvatu, koji nažalost nije sa nama večeras, s obzirom da su u HNK sinoć imali Filozofski teatar sa našom dragom gošćom. Sada nekoliko stvari da predstavim našu dragu gošću, sestru Terezu Furkadas. Sestra Tereza je zaista jedna vrlo zanimljiva časna sestra i nesvakidašnja, s obzirom da je uspela na neki način da spoji teologiju i kritiku kapitalizma i time se uglavnom i bavi u svim svojim radovima i knjigama. Magistrirala je teologiju, doktorirala je medicinu, oštra je kritičarka patrijarhata unutar katoličke crkve, s obzirom da je benediktanska časna sestra, i isto tako se zalaže za prava žena u crkvenoj i javnoj sferi. Takođe se bavi i kritikom farmaceutske industrije i napisala je nekoliko knjiga na tu temu. Večeras će održati predavanje, što je prvi put u Filozofskom teatru da imamo predavanje, nakon čega će publika imati prilike da postavlja naravno i pitanja kako to oduvek biva. Welcome, Sister Tereza. It is really great to have you here tonight. And now I will leave the stage to you and come back later.
Okay, thank you very much. So, my pleasure to be here in Belgrade. You might know, maybe Maja has said, but I couldn't follow the Serbian, so that yesterday I was in Zagreb, also at the National Theater. So today I arrived here and Spring Day welcomed me. And I know that now some demonstrations are also kind of welcoming, so it's best, right? The spring and demonstrations. My talk tonight and the lecture, I try to divide in two parts. The first one, I would like to address my critique to capitalism. I call it an ethical critique to capitalism. And in the second part, to go into some of my insights, my thoughts on feminism and what I consider important. Usually, the capitalism or the critique of capitalism alone, it's a whole lecture, and the second one, it's a whole lecture. So I'll try to not to give too much a headache to the translator, but I'll have to speak a bit quicker. So I start with that. What do I mean by ethical critique to capitalism? I start with this notion that seems so central in capitalism, which is the notion of freedom. Some people think it's a good way to approach the critique to socio-economical systems, thinking that capitalism values personal freedom, individual freedom, more than justice, more than equality. And of course there are other systems in history, socialism, communism, that try to value justice and social equality above this individual freedom. Well, I don't believe that's the case. I think that's a bad way to set up the stage, because I believe, and that comes from my religious belief, from my theology, from how I think the world is made. I do believe that the world has been made by God, and a good one. And I believe that the world is well made. And I believe it's also in our hands, because we have freedom. So for me, it cannot be incompatible. It cannot be a tension between something so precious that we call freedom and something so precious that we call justice. I don't believe in this dichotomy. And I think I can prove to you, and I'll try now, that what capitalism says is freedom, it's not. And it's only freedom for a few, which the right name of that is privilege, it's not freedom. So I'll start with that. There is a definition of freedom that it's the following, and when you hear it, it might sound like something acceptable, something neutral at least. And it is when we say, I don't know if you say it here in Serbia, you let me know, my freedom finishes where your freedom starts. Have you ever heard that? It's well known, right? My freedom finishes where yours start. At first glance, I said it might seem a very acceptable definition because it seems precisely that it's taking the other person into account, right? It's not like my freedom is all over, but I recognize I'm not alone in the world. So there is a need for me to accept the limits to my freedom posed by others. So as I said, it might be a definition that some of you have used sometimes in an acceptable manner. But if we go a bit deeper in that definition of freedom, what happens is that if my freedom really finishes where yours start, if I want to increase mine, what has to happen to yours? It's obvious it has to shrink, or what usually happens is I increase mine and you increase yours towards somewhere else, but somebody's going to pay the price. And that's what I think it's really happening in the world many times when there are processes of liberation in one place and then suddenly more oppression appears somewhere else. This is a competitive, really a territorial notion of freedom. But do we have, then I'll go into historical examples, but now I'm still at the theoretical level. Okay, do we have another definition of freedom? Do we have alternatives to this understanding of freedom? Here I could now go into the also theological understanding of freedom that comes from the Gospel of John or comes from the writings of Augustine in the 5th century. But because I suspect many in the audience might not be exactly Christian believers and church-goers, so I won't do it with a Christian example. If you ask me in the questions, I will love to do, but I will use another one, which is the anarchist tradition. If you start with Bakunin and some of the best anarchist thinkers, they talk differently about freedom. They don't say that my freedom competes with yours. They say that the saying about freedom in anarchist tradition is, I will not be free until all are free. That's a bit different, isn't it? It's completely different. What each of us who are here tonight, right? What do I think freedom is? Because if we're going to fight for something, if we are demonstrating and we want to do it in a way that is able to change things, well, that seems an important thing, right? What do I think it's freedom? And what is my notion of freedom? It's very different if I have eaten up and internalized the capitalist definition of freedom, which is territorial and competitive, my freedom against yours, or if I am convinced that whatever it is that I call my freedom has a synergic, a solidarian, right, interaction with yours. Whatever I think it's my freedom, when it grows, yours also grows. Or when yours grows, that helps me also to grow. And actually, as the tradition in anarchism goes, it's impossible for me to be free unless all are free. And so that we are together here. It's a bit different to start. But that's not the only one I can quote. I move on to somebody else, Rosa Luxemburg. I also would like to quote Saint Gertrude of Helfta, but okay, I won't quote a saint. I quote Rosa Luxemburg. And she, this founder of the Socialist Party in Germany, she said, freedom is always the freedom of the one who thinks differently. Another very interesting definition, very different from this first capitalist one. What do you mean freedom is always the freedom of the one who thinks differently? How I understand it, it means that I can only be free, or I can know how big my freedom is, the degree of my freedom, it's directly linked to the degree that I can hear a different opinion and hear a criticism and not expel the person. So we could say it's proportionate to my degree of non-xenophobia, or to expel the different, right? And there is a tendency, not only in fascism, we see it like growing in our societies, even in Europe now, that there is this tendency to praise homogeneity, right? And to think that this different one can go to find, and of course I know I'm talking to a place that had something to do with ethnic cleansing and all these problems, right? It's like peace or peaceful societies can only be achieved when the different, we just manage to get out, right? And so they go and they make their own thing, but let's get the different people have their place and be in peace, but don't bother us, right? So this idea is, of course, completely contrary to Rosa Luxemburg, and she would say a society that does that, a church that does that, a group, a human group that does that, it's the most unfree, it's the most enslaved of what? Of fear, always the contrary of freedom will be oppression, but an oppression that's not only from the outside, that many times also has an interior component, and that is out of fear. So freedom, the freedom of the one who thinks differently, always. And I still bring a third definition before I go into the practical examples, and that one is from another philosopher, that's Simone Weil, and she was an atheist the most part of her life, but at the end of her life, which is a very short life, she died with 34 years only in the Second World War, but when she was 28, she had some experiences that she called mystical experiences that came to her completely unexpectedly because she came from a Jewish family, then she became atheist, and she was very much involved in the workers' movement of the beginning of the 20th century. Then she had unexpectedly these Jesus experiences, so she wrote also in theological terms. But what I'm going to quote from her is from a work before she even had these more religious or mystical experiences. She wrote a book about the oppression and freedom in society, and there she speaks about freedom and says, freedom is not what capitalism tells us it is, which is the correspondence. I believe capitalism says freedom is the correspondence between my desire and its fulfillment. I want something, I get it, I'm free, right? Because I get what I want something, I cannot get it, then I'm unfree because it means somebody else is impeding me to achieve my desires. That, of course, is wonderful for consumism, right? You just get people moving with desires and trying to fulfill them, and if not, thinking that they are frustrated in life. This is, of course, a childish view about freedom and a very unrealistic, because desires are not necessarily there to be fulfilled. They have a poetic function in a human being, and they have to be, by its very definition, unending. You cannot have a desire adapted to reality, because then you have a desire that's like going flat on the ground, right? I might desire to fly. That's not a bad thing, and I'm not unfree because I cannot fly. I might desire to be at 3 places at the same time. That might be a bit objectionable, but that in itself, it doesn't make me unfree not to be able to fulfill. So what does Simone Weil say? Not the correspondence between desire and its fulfillment is freedom, but the correspondence between my thinking and my doing. That's something different also to pause and think about. My thinking and my doing, that has more to do with the contrary of hypocrisy, for example, or with personal coherence. And of course that definition of freedom also allows for an impingement from the outside, so an exterior obstacle to my freedom. Yes, because I might think that I need to help somebody and I might be prevented to do that, or even if I am not prevented by direct physical violence, I might have fear that the state will punish me if I go and help. Now in Spain there is a law that they passed that if you help people that are illegal immigrants, you're going to get in prison, right? Yourself. So people might think that's the best thing to do, but then by fear you are impeded to do that. But of course this correspondence between thinking and doing, Simone Weil applied to a society, and so she said a free society is a society where the people who make decisions and those who carry them on are the same. That's her way of looking at that, because otherwise we have people saying to others how things should be, and others that then have to carry it on. Okay, that's the definition of oppression. And I believe our societies in the 21st century are moving rapidly more and more in this direction. We even have something, you might have it in Serbia also, called, I don't know, well, in my country we call it gestión, but this is like management probably. People that have a vocation to be managers. So that means their vocation is to tell other people what to do. Well, I have a problem with that. I don't think that's a vocation. You can have a vocation, a call to be a biologist or a sociologist or whatever, 100,000 things, but you cannot have a vocation to be a manager. Do you have schools of management here? Okay, so I have a problem with that. Because before, it used to be that we called liberal with this strange thing that happens to the word liberal, that of course it's from freedom, right? A strange thing because sometimes we use liberal in a positive sense, right? And other times liberal means precisely the people that are less prone to help us create a free society. So in the positive sense, we were using a word called liberal professions. Are you familiar with that? So for example, medicine, I'm a doctor, also medical doctor, medicine or teachers or lawyers, all this would be liberal professions, as opposed to what? To asalariados, that is salary workers, or how do we call? Workers, yes, but I'm sorry that we say just workers, but it's workers that are employed by somebody else, right? So that they just have to do whatever others tell them. And the best example of this worker status would be this Charles Chaplin, The Modern Times, right? Have you seen the movie? It's like terrible, right? He expresses so beautifully and poetically also. So you just have to do something that does not correspond to who you are as a human being. Human being is a thinking and feeling person. If you work, your daily work, you cannot think because somebody else thinks for you, right? And if you think, it will be only frustrating because you're thinking nobody cares in your job. What is that doing to your human being? And feeling is the same thing, right? In your work, you cannot bring, if you are a doctor, you can think because that's your responsibility. You are expected, but I'll tell you what's happening now because we don't think anymore. But, well, not all. But it used to be that precisely that's expected from you. You might make mistakes, but as a human, you could be realized in your work because it was expected from the patients, from the state, from your colleagues that you had an active thinking. What's the diagnosis? What am I going to be as a treatment? What will I do? And also feeling, right? Because that goes together with the profession. A teacher is the same thing. You expect the teacher to be thinking, and you expect the teacher to be feeling. And a lawyer, well, lawyers, I don't know if they are feeling, but also, of course, you would expect from what it means to have a sense of justice, right? To do that. Workers in a factory, they are not expected to be thinking. Simone Weil, this philosopher, she was a professor of philosophy, but she said something which is, it's very strange that all these leaders of left-wing movements and of workers' movements, and she was quoting at that time Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, they have never set foot in a factory. That's what she said, right? So then she said, me neither, so I better go, so that I can be free, I can be coherent, what I think and what I do. So she quit with her job as a chair of philosophy, and then she went into 3, 4, 5 factories. She was being laid out, because she was very good in her brain, but very bad in her hands, right? So she had to be saved by another fellow worker from almost being burned completely. But she was saved, but how many workers were burned, right? Because they might also be as unfit for the work as Simone Weil, or they might be the best fitted, but they are exhausted, right? So we know all this. So basically, Simone Weil, with this definition of freedom, she's getting at, as I was saying, that today, not only this status of worker without space for your thinking in your job, without a space for your feeling in your job, is widespread, not only in Bangladesh, but also the so-called liberal professions, the ones that before had the privilege of being professions to which you could bring your whole humanity. Today, they are more and more proletariized. How can I make the right? Whatever, you've understood, right? What I mean? Like unliberalized or whatever. Made like that, because my colleagues, I'm not now working as a doctor, because for 20 years I've been in monastery, I write about medical topics, but I am not in a hospital. But my colleagues who are in a hospital are telling me it's horrible, you don't want to come back, because we have more and more these computers that are telling us how to do things. And I'm not again, because medicine is complex, so I'm not against guidelines that come to you as recommendations, right? Okay, we recommend, that could be good, but that's not what they are telling me. Those are not guidelines that come as recommendations. They are mandatory. You have to do it. And guidelines are multiplying themselves, and that has to do with capitalism, because when you, in a guideline, you have to do, with chest pain, you have to do this test 3 times, right? Every 8 hours, and that's a protocol. If you get that guideline approved by the state, then, and you are the company that sells the test, you are the most happy, right? Because you know, all doctors, mandatory, will have to do 3 times the test, whether they would have done it from themselves or not, because it's mandatory. And doctors, they know they have a responsibility, but if they don't do what it is mandatory, they know they can be denounced if the patient doesn't go well. So this is a situation that if it were like a minor thing, I would not bring it up, but it's growing, and it's even with medications that some doctors, me included, have problems with. For example, with the drugs that are for cholesterol, when the person has not had any heart attack or any event that we call primary prevention for cholesterol. This is worse to take a medication than not to take it. And many doctors know that. Okay, but the machine might tell you, you have to give it. So that's a problem. But I'll go quick on that. It's something more. Before the hospitals, who would be the director of a hospital? One of the doctors, right? And we would do it in a rotatory way. In the schools, who would be, before, I don't know in Serbia, but in my country, the director of a school? One of the teachers. And then you would not especially like it, because it's like, oh, okay, that's my year to just do this service to the others. But you know, after that year, you would be back to the normal teaching, right? So you would be careful not to pass certain normatives that then you would suffer, right? Today, that's changed, right? Director of a hospital is an economist. It's a manager. And they will never be one of those who are being ruled by the rules. That's a problem. That's what Simone Weil says. This is going the wrong direction. And director of a school, more and more, is maybe an ex-teacher, but somebody that certainly might be there for 20 years. As director, I don't know, in Serbia, did you have also directors that were rotatory at some point? Because that seems to me the normal way to organize itself when you are free to do it. The free people, right, in a monastery, that also we have our own history of deviations from the basic rule, but the rule that comes from the 6th century says, okay, the nuns come together and they elect which one is going to be the abbess, right? And for how long? Until they have enough. So that means enough and another one comes. So it seems the normal thing. I believe that's how we all would do it when we are free to organize ourselves as we wish. Or as we think it's better. But that's not how things are moving. So this all at the theoretical level. But let me go to the practical. And the practical, I continue with my critique that capitalism has nothing to do with freedom. Why? Capitalism still today is telling us that capitalism is all about private initiative and it wants to reduce the state to a minimum, right? So the state can just maybe be there but not bother the economy, because the economy needs to be ruled by this invisible hand and by the laws of the market and competition. That's the narrative, right? That's the rhetoric of it. But it's never been like that in history, right? From the beginning of early capitalism, we have a period of history that we still, and I think that's a shame, we still in the 21st century call that protectionism. That was at the beginning of capitalism. We had what? We had the state passing laws to protect the interests of a few industrials, a few owners, right? And of a few trades, or how do you say that? Industrials is okay? Okay, passing laws. And in that passing laws, they were protecting what they call the national interest, right? But that's a misnomer. What is the national interest? It's the interest of a few companies that were not national. They were privately owned, these companies. But it was identified as a national interest because supposedly they were giving work to so many people that if we let them down, does it sound familiar, too big to fail? Right? The same banks of now. They didn't think, okay, these capitalists cannot manage their business, so we are going to just share it in a cooperative way and we are going to come up with another system, right? No, we're just like the banks, the same thing, right? We just are going to put the state at the service of these very few. And what I find hateful of our misnomer protectionism is because at that very moment, it was the moment in history where the workers, and especially the children of the workers, were at the least protected. We had a woman in Catalonia called, still now we know her as Elizabeth 5 Hours. And it's like, okay, who was she? She was a worker that all her life was devoted to a cause. And the cause was that children, and I'm talking about the end of the 19th century, that children do not work more than 5 hours shifts in a factory. They were working 10 hours, they were working 12 hours and sometimes the night shift. I'm talking end of the 19th century. And all this period of time, we still call protectionism. I think we should call it unprotectionism. So make visible from whose perspective we are making history. Because the only ones protected were these few capitalists, these few supposedly entrepreneurs that needed the Papa state to back them up, otherwise they would not have been able to thrive. And the workers, the children were working in the factory, and the parents of the children, if they demonstrated, they were killed directly, right? Or put in prison. And we still call that protectionism. So this freedom It's freedom for whom at the beginning of capitalism? Not freedom for the capitalist in that like lonely way, but you have the backup of the state. You are using the power of the state, the power of the police to advance your economical interests, and of course not freedom for the majority of people, the workers, their children. Okay, but it's a long time ago, right? From the protectionist era. Now Trump is going back to it, but that's another story. But I do have examples of the present, of course, and I will only give two of them. One is, do you remember these swine flu epidemics of the 2009, right? At that time, I studied what was happening because I had reasons, being also a specialist in infectious diseases, to doubt that the alarm, the degree of alarm that was being spread by no less than the WHO, right? The highest authority in health matters in the world. But nevertheless, it didn't hold water. It was not really corresponding to what we knew scientifically about that flu. But I will not go on that now. Also, I won't go on now on the fact that when the vaccine came, also I had reason, and I was not alone in that. I've published about it, and other people like Tom Jefferson has done the same. Reasons to believe, first, that the virus was not that bad, and second, that the vaccine was not that good. Right? But now I won't go into the medical, because what I want to do is to do a political analysis, an analysis of the fact that if, let's take it as if it were true, that the virus could kill millions of people, and it deserved, as if it were true, that it deserved the level 6 of alarm. That's the maximum level of alarm that we have. And let's take it as if it were true that the vaccine was the solution, right? Because then it's when it becomes interesting to do the political analysis. That was not true, that also not true, but let's take it as if it were to do the political analysis. Because if it were true, as we were made to believe, that that could be the worst health emergency in history, killing millions, everybody remember with masks in Mexico and being shown, and the airports at the degree, I don't know, was it bad here, the degree of alarm? In Spain, it was very crazy. So let's believe that, and then do you remember in September 2009, something was said which was, maybe there will not be vaccine for everybody. Do you remember that? That, yes? Okay, so why maybe there would not be vaccine for everybody? Because the WHO, the same agency that was spreading the alarm in the whole world, allowed four means not a few, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 pharmaceutical companies to hold the patent. That means to explode in monopoly situation the pandemic vaccine. That meant that these 4 companies said we might not have enough power to manufacture vaccine for everybody. But of course their rights of patent were, number one, were placed before the life of millions of people, because who couldn't care less about the rights of patent? You say, give us this vaccine and we're going to make it in all laboratories in Serbia, in Spain, in Croatia, all over the world. We are speaking of an emergency as no other could be bigger, right? Why didn't we have all laboratories in the world making the vaccine? I'm happy we didn't, because the vaccine had problems. But that's why I said, let's make the political analysis. Am I making the point clear? But that's a very serious thing. How did we allow that to happen? Also, these companies, they are, if you have had the opportunity to read the last report of Oxfam International that says 1% of the population has accumulated more wealth than the 99%, guess what? These 4 companies are in the 1%. So it's not that they needed to meet, how do you say in English, meet life ends, or right, to earn some money. That's the extra super rich companies that we are now going to respect the right above, as if they were more important than the right to life of the millions of people. But not only that, they had to put a price, right, to the vaccine. And what did they do, these 4 companies? They put the highest price ever for a flu vaccine. And some countries in the third world, they could not afford to buy the vaccine. So what did they do? They had to cut their budget in health. They had to cut their budget in health issues that affected children and adults and elderly and everybody to buy the vaccines, because the vaccines were extra price so that the companies could make business. And that just went on And the governments of the world just went on. There is worse things still, because this company said, if we have to make vaccine for everybody, then we are going to change the formula so we can make it quicker. But because we change the formula, maybe there will be side effects, and we cannot be responsible. So they forced the governments, they invited the governments to sign some clauses that said, if something bad happens with the vaccine, we, the governments, will take the responsibility. So you, the people, will pay for that, right? Not the companies. So it's a netto benefit. If you've heard this sentence, the benefits are privatized and the losses are made public, socialized. That's exactly what happened here. And this is, again, only one country I know of, was Poland, that had at that time Eva Kopacz as the Minister of Health, but she came of a very bad experience with Novartis, a pharmaceutical. She said no to this clause. And I know, and the world knows, that the pharmaceutical companies were posing this clause that gave all responsibility to the government. We know it because Eva Kopacz said it. Otherwise, we would not even know. We, the democratic people, right? So she said it, the companies didn't back up, because if they did in one country, they had to do it everywhere, and Poland did not buy one single vaccine. And what happened with the flu in Poland? Nothing. Nothing. That's why I know, and we all know, right, that it was not justified. But again, let's leave the medicine, the medical part aside, and think, pause still a moment about what it means that we, the people of the world and the governments and everyone, went along with this. Did you read many articles that were denouncing this and were saying these many parties that said, okay, that we don't allow, or what's going on? That's very wrong, huh? And final example is with the TTIP, you call it like this, the free trade agreement, right? In 2012, I think it was, 12 December 2012, I remember because it's 12-12-12, right? That the New York Times, which is not exactly the most left-wing newspaper of the world, the New York Times published an article on Namibia, a state in Africa, saying, in 2010, Namibia approved a law to restrict the propaganda that tobacco companies could make in the public media. And 2010, they wrote 2012, the law has not been implemented because Philip Morris, the tobacco company, sued the government. Now wait a minute, how can a private company sue a government that's doing its job, right? Because, well, that's what other governments, I don't know, in Serbia, do you have some regulation on tobacco? For example, do the tobacco, they need to say tobacco kills you, right? Okay, well, that tobacco companies don't like that, right? So in first world countries, in Europe, US, they have more pressure because people are more aware, right, that tobacco can be bad for your health. So they, for a few years already, have moved their business to so-called third world countries, especially the sub-Saharan Africa and China. And in the sub-Saharan Africa and China, they target especially the women, and they target especially the teenagers. So Namibia, they realized that and they wanted to protect the population, so they said nothing strange, simply the same thing that might be happening in Serbia or is happening in Catalonia or Spain. But then how could a company sue a government? Okay, it had not power to do it unless the government had signed an agreement, right, bilateral agreement, saying we will not hurt the interest of North American companies, and then we'll get some money from the North Americans or some help or some military whatever, an exchange, so-called bilateral agreements, of which the New York Times informed in 2012, there were already in the world more than 3,000. And you might think, okay, but Namibia, what can Namibia do? Why didn't Namibia fought against this? Because to fight this, you need more money than they have for their whole budget. This Philip Morris has 200 or maybe 2,000, I don't know how many lawyers that are only devoted to do that. And the government cannot afford that, so they didn't even start it. And you might think Namibia is a small country, okay, but that happened also to Egypt. Egypt raised their minimum wage, which is a good thing, right? The government does that. And it was sued by a Belgian company that had 3,000 employees in Egypt because it said, if you raise the minimum wage, I will lose money. Can you imagine what that is? This is the corruption, utter corruption of democracy. A democratic government is a government that has to be defending the interest of the majority of people, right? And if you have this dependency on the interest of companies, what do you want to have? A government that only works and passes law that go along with the big interest of companies. That's what happened at the beginning of capitalism, and now that's what the same thing, right? It's trying to be implemented in even a more open way. Before it was also open because at the beginning of capitalism, the same owner of the factory was the brother or the cousin or the father of the one who was governing in politics, right? They were the same family, so nothing new. But nowadays, it's happening through these treaties, and the TTIP, the Free Trade Agreement, you might know that already, right? Had these clauses that said that companies could sue governments when the governments affected their investment perspectives, right? So that's exactly what happened in Greece also. In Greece, some bankers had invested there with expectations of having a return. Well, capitalism, right? You just took a risk and you lost. No. You took a risk and you don't accept losing. So then you force politically so that the people of Greece has to pay you because you cannot have losses. Well, I think I made the point, right, about that thing. So I'll move to the second point because the first point is clear to me. Capitalism, not theoretically, not philosophically, not practically, not historically, not before, not today, has nothing to do with freedom. It has only to do with freedom of a few, which I don't call freedom, I call privilege. And privilege is, of course, against justice. And privilege is contrary to justice. But freedom of the people, that cannot be contrary to justice. So I move to the second point. The second point is, second point of my critique to capitalism. Capitalism says the best way to make dynamic an economy, the best way to organize an economy is to place at the center of it the maximization of profit. So that everybody that goes into economic activity has as its goal to maximize the profit, to earn as much as possible. If everybody does that, that is good for the economy. That says capitalism, right? Here I could quote immediately, like the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 6, that says you cannot serve God and the money. It's the only way that puts an exclusion of this type. It says you cannot serve God and the money. So you serve the one, you don't serve the other. But I leave the quote of Matthew at one side and continue with this idea of maximization of profit. Do I think it's right to try to earn money with your work? Well, if the society is so organized that you need money to buy bread, then of course it's right to try to earn money, and I myself can present myself to you as a businesswoman, because I'm a nun, I'm in a monastery, but we have a workshop. We do ceramics at the monastery, and we sell the ceramics, so we have a business, right? It's a cooperatively owned business, we are 30 of us, but it's a business, and of course we want to earn money with our business, because we want to eat, and also because the rule of Benedict says nuns should not live off endowment, right, or of money that other people give, although it's always welcome if somebody does a donation, but they should work of their own work, right? They should live on their own work, and there is something called ora et labora. Maybe you've heard that in Latin, is to work and to pray, because working is not to make money, working is also to, as I said before, to bring your thinking and your feeling capacity to make the world a better place. So okay, we have a business. Do we try to meet life ends? Yes, we try to be sustainable, but are we trying with our business to earn as much money as possible? Of course not. If we were trying to earn, if we were in the capitalist direction trying to earn as much money as possible, we would be paying the people who help us as little as possible. And we would only pay more if we were sure, or we're not sure, we're afraid that this person would leave and no other would replace, right? Because if we knew that the person could leave and another would work for even less, then we should go in this direction. That's what capitalism is telling me. How can we not do an ethical critique of capitalism? That's corruption of the relationship in the workplace, because you are incentivizing something that in itself is corrupted. And also because two consequences of that happen today, which first one is something called programmed obsolescence. That means I am an owner of a factory, I manufacture something. Should I try to make it as good as possible? No. In capitalism, no. I should make it in a way that gives me the most profit, right? So, stockings, for example. Stockings, when they appeared, there was one engineer that could design stockings in a way that they wouldn't break. Okay, so they put that discovery in a drawer, right? Because can you imagine that the stockings never break? That would be wonderful, right? No, not for the capitalist. You prefer to have an item that breaks, and then you have to buy it again. Printers. Some of the printers, I don't know if it has happened to you, they go perfectly well, and suddenly, pop, they don't work anymore, but they didn't fail, and you don't know why. Take it to the store and say, okay, but like it to be repaired. Oh, it will cost you more to repair it than to buy a new one, right? You've heard that, no? And then you buy a new one, right? But why did it stop working? Some of the printers have a chip inside that actually it says after a certain number of thousand pages, stop working. So people can go and buy another one. That's not only corruption of what it means to be an engineer, to be working to the relationship of trust that's basic in the society, but also it creates piles and piles of waste that some European countries, smartly enough, send to Africa, or sending to Africa. Because can you imagine just the millions of items that daily are being discarded? For example, people have gotten used in my country to say, things built before are stronger. Before people built things better. That makes no sense. Is the technique, and is society going backwards? Are we unable to produce washing machines that last like the old ones lasted? Of course not. But it's not in the interest of this capitalist understanding of economy. That's programmed obsolescence. And the last one in the second point is something called the cost of opportunity. The calculation of opportunity cost, it's called. Are we doing okay with how opportunity cost, right? What is this? Well, it's the same logic, right? You have at the center maximization of profit. You are the CEO, the manager of a big company. You have the stockholders, right? So you have an obligation. You have only one. It is to make as much money as possible, right? That's what they are going to force you to when they examine you once a year. That's what you'll be fired for. If somebody can prove that you have failed making as much money as were possible. And one way to do that is to compare how much your business would earn if your factory, you keep it in Belgrade, and you just calculate there how protected the workers in Belgrade are, and how much you have to pay for taxes in the environment, and how much you have to pay for transportation of your items. Now you do the calculation if you take your factory to Vietnam, which is one of the places that's really happening. Of course, in Vietnam, if you have your customers in Serbia, it would, of course, add extra costs for transportation. But it might be, if you are a big company, that what you're going to pay the workers and what you're going to pay the state for taxes of environment and other issues that are very important are so low that it's worth it for you to move your factory to Vietnam. And by doing that, not only you're going to leave, of course, people in Serbia without these jobs, but you are creating another perversion, another corruption, another ethically objectionable, highly objectionable dynamic, which is you create a perverse competition in third world countries, which is the less protected their workers, the more business they get. So they compete between them, because of course it might be, again, if you have national interest defending somebody who gives a job to a few thousand people, that's exactly what's happening today in Vietnam, in Bangladesh. You raise your taxes for the contamination of the environment, and the companies might move somewhere else. You bring them low, and then you get a bonus, right? You are bonified. This economical system is so wonderful, ethically and otherwise, that it just applauds you when you do the worst thing possible. And it penalizes you, it punishes you as an economic productive unit. It penalizes you if you do the right thing. So that's the second point, how absurd it is to speak of maximization of profit. And the last one is what actually we understand under the notion, Marxist notion of alienation. I already talked at the beginning of what it means to be a worker that cannot make decisions with what you work, but it's even worse. I was in 2004 in a meeting of abbots, Benedictine abbots in Rome, and I was a translator for English into Spanish. And they had invited an ex-directive of Deutsche Bank to speak to the abbots, 400 abbots of all the world. And this man, yeah, I know that's the problem, but okay, that I won't go into that. And what he said, I had to translate. And he was saying, some people think that capitalists are not ethics. We are objectionably ethically because we go to a third world country and we make $1,000 with the work of a worker and we pay the worker only $1. And some people think this is exploitation and abuse and not ethical. But that's not true, he said. Because what will make it ethical or unethical is not how much do we win and how much do we pay. The real question is, before we came to this country, how much was the worker winning? If the worker was dying from hunger, and we came and we give $1, this is a good thing to have done. So I was the translator and I just choked. So I couldn't go on. And I said, I'm only the translator. What he's saying is horrible. And so they didn't invite me anymore to be the translator, right? But so goes on. So here, only to tell you that actually there is a writer that many of you might know. It's Enrique Dussel. He's a philosopher that comes from Argentina and calls himself Philosopher of Liberation, because there is something called theology of liberation, and he thinks philosophy can also go in that direction, to just put the poor at the center. And his philosophy of liberation, he's written a book called The Theological Metaphors of Karl Marx. And that book, for me, of course, very interesting, is showing, sorry, that I have. First of all, when I did my doctoral dissertation in theology, I wrote it in Trier, that's a city in Germany, which is actually where Marx was born. And the monastery, the Benedictine monastery, it's neighbors with Marx's house, right? So we were neighbors. Not today, it's somebody else. But I learned, which I didn't know, that Marx had to study theology. And actually, I went to the library where he had been studying, and I could see in Marx's museum some of the exams in theology that he gave when he was 17. So this author, Enrique Dussel, is showing how the notion of alienation actually comes from the Old Testament, that Marx, of course, was Jewish in the family. The father had converted to Protestantism, but the mother never did. The notion of alienation is when the prophets go and try to speak of, at that time, religions that were surrounding these prophets of the Old Testament were asking for human sacrifices. So gods were saying, your first newborn you kill and you honor God, right? So these prophets are going, because you might know in the Bible there is one episode of Abraham and Isaac, that it seems that Abraham is God asks that it kills, but as you might know, how it ends is the surprise. It's not how it begins. For us, of course, it's a surprise that God tells, kill your son. But that was not a surprise at that time, culturally. The surprise is the end of it, which is when God appears and says, no, you don't have to do that to prove your faith. Your faith, you don't have to prove killing your son. That's the surprise. That's something new. So at that time, the prophets were going and telling people, how can you kneel in front of idols that are asking you to do human sacrifices? This idol, it's something you have done with your hands. It's the word fetichism. That's also a word in Marxism. It comes from the Latin verb facere, which means to do. Fetiche is something made, handmade, man-made, women-made. So this fetiche is something that you have made. But after having made it, of course, for it to serve you, because you have made it, right? You put it in a pedestal. Pedestal is right? You put it in a pedestal. You kneel in front of that thing that you have made, and you allow that thing to ask of you human sacrifices. Are you crazy or what? That said the prophets, right? Stand up and just take that into your hands and realize that this has to serve you, not you to serve that thing, right? Okay, so what does Marx do? He says the economical system. Who has made that? Just came from heaven? No, we have made it, probably not we, exactly we, but it's man-made, right? So how do we allow that system to have us kneeling? And how do we allow it to request from us human sacrifices? When Marx is writing that, we have to remember that Marx was in London in that freezing apartment where his 1-year-old son died from cold. So he writes about that, and he says, my son was given to the god of the economy, right? Which is man-made, but to which human sacrifices are made every day. So he's comparing that to these ancient practices that he thinks are carried on in the modern times, that ancient people might be alienated because they believed in a God that could punish them and they were fearing that God. We are guess what? Putting the economy in the place of God. And Dussel also shows that there is a passage in the New Testament called the Philippenses, the letter to the Philippenses, it's chapter 2, where there is a very beautiful text that says, Christ, being of divine condition, made himself a slave, because it came to serve, not to be served. Marx takes that passage without saying it, that's the author Dussel that makes you show that, makes you see that, and says, money, being, and he's using the same German word, Knechtsgestalt, money, being of the condition of a slave, it made itself a god. And now it's asking, so it's exactly the contrary dynamic, right? So this word of fetishism and alienation as not having the realization that it is in your hands. And if we want, as a society, which I would very much dislike, but if we decide that because we won, we are going to have poor people dying, and we're going to have a planet that produces enough food for 11,000 million people, and we are 7,500 million people, and people still 1,000 go hungry. If we want it like this, I will hate it, but at least we won't be alienated. We will be doing it with open eyes. But that's not the situation. The situation for many people is to say what Margaret Thatcher taught us to say, right? There is no alternative. So that's my critique of capitalism, is that these three are the three moments that I think have to be taken into account, and that make for anybody, not only somebody that necessarily has a ready plan, although I have some suggestions of how we could advance and move. How are we doing with time?
45 minutes.
I have done already 45 minutes?
Now.
What?
Yes, now.
Until now.
Until now, huh? So what do I do? Do I move to feminism and then you ask me more about the maybe solutions or something? Well, solutions, I mean, yes or what? Okay. So for feminism, I start with something which unfortunately is a well-known problem. It's this gender violence, right? Gender violence, we call something that it has this prevalence that doesn't seem to be going away. Even some sad reports say gender violence is increasing. It might not be true worldwide that it is increasing. It might be true, but it might also be that women report it more than before, and so we get numbers that grow, but it's for sure that it's not decreasing, right? So it might be still there, it might even be increasing, but not decreasing. If you have worked in battered women's shelters or know somebody who does, you might, I think, be familiar with something that's very paradoxical, which is the following. A woman that goes into a shelter for battered women, do you know what's the most prevalent feeling of the woman who has been attacked, battered by the man they love? Okay. Every audience, Zagreb, Belgrade, Japan, which I have not been, but with Japanese people, in Boston, in Barcelona, everywhere, everybody knows the answer, right? That makes no sense, absolutely no sense. If you have been battered, you have to have anger, right? A sense of injustice, something bad has been done to you. Where does it come from that you have guilt? But it's more than that. When the man accompanies the woman, and that's what happened to me in Boston, because as you might know, right, in gender violence, it's not that they are all the time like with the battle. Normally, there is like a cycle, which is that the man acts violently, and then it just kneels in front of the woman and just cries and feels that I cannot live without you, and I will never again do it, and you know how I love you, and then comes what they call the honeymoon period, and then it happens again. So in this case, the man accompanied her to be taken care of, and the man was saying, the woman had this guilt feeling, because she was saying, well, you know, when he arrived, he just slammed the door in a certain way. I should have known better, right? Should have not told him what I told him, whatever. That's what she was thinking. And he was upset. He said, you know, doctor, you don't have a clue how much I love this woman. If I have done this to her, which he was not denying, is because somebody has done something much worse to me. And that somebody else was, of course, not her, but society, the system, the work that he was mistreated in the workforce. Somebody was affecting him in a way that was unfair, and that was his feeling. And the feeling of her was, I have done something wrong. See what I mean with that? It's a complete reversal of what would be logical to find. Logically, we would find the anger in her and the guilt in him. That seems logic, right? But we find it reversed. And there is a woman whom I like to read, which is Julia Kristeva, is a psychoanalyst, that has studied this. And she says something, I think it's important. She says, when we are little, right, either man or women, when we were infants, all of us had the body and the psyche of a woman at our disposal to fulfill our needs, emotional and physical needs. And she thinks, of course, it's excellent when men also take care of the little infants, but men cannot substitute the body of the woman in the sense that they cannot give the breast, they can give the bottle, but we know it's better if possible and without putting any extra pressure, but it's better to give the breast if possible. And the body of the woman has this characteristic that even in the Bible, the oldest name for God, it's El Shaddai, and El Shaddai is the name that is translated God the Almighty. But some exegetes think that it should be translated God with two breasts. And it sounds a bit different, right? Like, how can you go from the Almighty to the breast? Well, it's not so far a jump, because this sense of Almighty is, well, the word El Shaddai means, Sada means also mountain, right? And so what's our first experience of being protected? Well, you just imagine you are the infant and you have here the breasts of your mother and you are under the breast and you are protected. You are sure that you can let go. You have a sense of being taken care of. So it seems the first name that the Bible saves for God comes from that experience. And so it's putting God as if God had these big two breasts that are protecting you in a way that you can really trust. Actually, the Bible speaks of the mountains that give out milk. You remember that? Maybe somebody? Like milk and honey come from the mountains, and you feel, how the mountains? Have you seen any mountains that give milk? Well, yes, these ones, right? When we were little, we saw mountains that were protecting us and also were giving us milk. So it seems that that comes from these first. Also, the breasts are one of the parts of the body that are more affected in the gender violence, right? That are most object of this violence. So basically, the idea would have to do with something that challenges directly what we understand in patriarchy, which is that women, because they identify with the mother, patriarchy says that's a good thing, right? Women identify with the mother, and so we have one part of the society able to take care of others, able to love more maybe than to be free. But this is good because the other half, it's more able to take initiative. That would be, I'm repeating now the stereotypes for masculinity and femininity in patriarchy. And even there is, as the story goes, there is a complementarity that makes that this more capacity, greater capacity to love of women and greater capacity to be free or independent of men, they kind of complement each other, and that's why the heterosexual couple, so it's the ideal couple. Okay, well, I think that's problematic, and I think that's problematic because my anthropology, you cannot separate love and freedom. I said before, you cannot separate freedom and justice. You cannot separate love and freedom. Maybe our culture is used that you cannot separate love and freedom, but not so used that you cannot separate freedom from love. I'll explain that. You cannot separate love from freedom. I think that's pretty much something accepted in our society because you say, love has to be free, right? If you are forced to love, what kind of love is this? You have to just do it because you want. It has to come from your heart. I think that's not problematic in our society to think this way. But the other way, to think that you cannot be free unless you are loving, I think that sounds strange in our culture, right? Our culture tends to think that freedom is something neutral that you can use to do whatever you want. I said it before. So that you can use your freedom to attack somebody, that you can use your freedom to even hurt another person. And this is objectionable, but it's still your freedom. And that's why there are problems in some instances where people confront even acts of violence with this necessity to protect freedom understood in a certain way. So why do I say that freedom cannot be separated of love? Has to do with what I said before, my understanding of freedom, and also that I believe we, human beings, all have been made for love and freedom, and that means I only stop loving when I am fearful. I will only stop doing something loving to another person if I fear that person might hurt me, if I fear that person might deceive me, if I fear that person might mock me, right? Like make fun of me. If I fear, I'll be punished in some way. Otherwise, I believe that's what I do when I am truly free. So that this inability to separate, I'll give now some concrete examples. Women are more loving than men. Sure? Okay, there is something that most men know, which is women do many favors for you, the women that you love, but they have a mental list. And they put in that mental list all the favors they have done for you. And then at the least expected moment, they start throwing them back at you. The day we got married, I did this, and then it's something that it's like an auto-reverse, right? You know this cassette that when it finished, it started again? So that's something that it doesn't sound unfamiliar, this critique, and it comes from somewhere, because love, it's only to be understood as free. So if you really do something out of love, you do it in a way that the gospel says your right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. So that you do it and you are so happy to be able to do it because that's exactly what you want to do. That's an act of love. And you don't remember, I did that for you. So that if I do an act of favor to somebody else and I keep that in a mental list, for me it means it was not an act of love, really. It was something else that I'll give it a name now. But don't worry, for the men it's the same thing, right? The men are more free. Oh, sure, more independent. Manuel Castells is a sociologist, a Catalan sociologist that has been working many years in Berkeley, in California, and has a very interesting trilogy, 3 books called The Society of Information. In the second volume, the 4th chapter, is the end of patriarchy. And he gives analysis and statistics that are, I think, very interesting. I will only quote one, is the following. Majority of couples that divorce, that separate, when they had a real serious relationship, for the following 2 years, he and she, both of them, heterosexual couples here, are being analyzed and studied. Both of them will suffer for 2 years a decrease in the health indicators, because for both that's something stressful. Okay, after the second year, the majority of men will have a new couple. The majority of women will not. But the interesting thing is, what happened to the men when we compare their health to those that do not get a new couple, right? We compare the health of those men when they are living alone with the health when they are living with a woman. And which one is better is very clear. It's better the health of the men that are living with a woman. Now we compare the health of the women that are living alone with the health of the women that are living with a man. And guess what? I guess you are laughing because you know what I'm going to say, right? But it's true and it's very clear. The health of the women is better when they are alone. Who is more independent? That is a very clear situation that also goes together with something that happens in patriarchy. I remember my grandmother telling me, Teresa, the men, you have to have them happy and lying to them, right? So that they don't know the truth. I thought, what is she telling me? I was small, right? But that was the advice of a patriarchal grandmother, right? And I don't think this was only my grandmother that thought that way. So what is this? Isn't patriarchy the society that put the men on top? On top of what? Of a lie. Is that what it is? Because is that something that most women know? That this is a lie? And that you have to just, in patriarchy, just be like this with a man and just say, oh yes, oh how interesting. And you are thinking something else, and then when you get with your friends, you do what I saw in a movie that I recommend, but I saw it before I entered the monastery, so that's only 20 years ago. So maybe you can find it. It was a movie from Tunisia. The title was Al-Fawin. Very, for me, interesting movie, and it was a scene that it looked like typical patriarchal scene, like the woman in Tunisia, so an Islamic country. They had inside of an inner courtyard. They were all working on vegetables and talking to each other. Then the men entered from the outside, and then they immediately stood up and went to get some water and to serve the men. The men interacted briefly with them, and then the men left again. And then the women started to criticize the men with each other, right? And especially to say, you know what happened yesterday in bed and the sexual thing and he couldn't, and like that, with each other, right? So you felt, what's going on here? What is this contrast between this extreme respect showed when the men entered and now all this talk? Okay, that I experienced in my monastery also. Well, not exactly what I experienced. But just wait. When I entered, now it doesn't happen, but 20 years ago, a priest would come and we would all stand up, right? Which I realized if another nun came, we didn't stand up, oh, hello, hello, come in. But with the priest, we would all stand up. But when the priest left, then, right, that's bad. I'm glad that we laugh with it, but it's in reality, it's horrible, right? What is this? What is this relationship? I told them, to my companions at the monastery, I said, because you know what? Patriarchal society, something is wrong, because the same society that's patriarchal is a society that says men are like, how do you say, like children, right? Do you say that? It's familiar with that? But it doesn't say women are like children. It says men, males, right, are like children. And I said that to my community. And then one of the sisters said, men are like children and priests are like two children. So I thought, okay, and I thought the reason she was answering like this is because if we are made to be equal, men and women, male and female, to be treated equally. Now, if we have a society that pushes that and tries to pretend that one is above the other in whatever salary or recognition, social recognition, you have something that Hegel studied as the dialectic master-slave, right? You just have to get a compensation of that. So I thought in the church, in so much that the church is even more patriarchal in its structure, then you have to double compensate. And then it comes this double child that this sister is spontaneously 80 years old, she just said, right? But more things about that. In patriarchy, men, women, adult women, who do they have as their best body or the one they trust the most? Well, it's not usually the husband or the couple, it's usually another woman. Now I could raise the hands here, not undoing, but we could ask, right? Raise the hand of the women here that have as the confidant, right? Another woman that can be your mother, even if you are an adult woman. It can be your daughter, it can be your sister, it can be a friend. But normally it's another woman. I mean, you know what I mean, right? That you really trust, that you know when you're hurt, when you are down, when you need some emotional support, you go to a woman. And what about the men? They go to men, right? No, they go to a woman. Usually not his woman, usually. That's patriarchy. I'm not saying you are doing it. I'm saying patriarchy works like this. Something is fundamentally wrong in patriarchy. And what I think is fundamentally wrong has to do with something that, now it might be not enough time to explain, but it's what psychoanalysts call this child subjectivation. Like as children, we have to come up with an identity because we were during 9 months and still after for a while in what's called oceanic experience with the mother, right? Like we are one. So this idea that the mother is one and I am another, that's not a spontaneous thing to happen because at the beginning I just want to move my right hand and I go order of the brain and the hand moves. I want the breast and I go the breast comes. Because at the beginning, the very beginning of my extrauterine experience, if the breast doesn't come, I'm gonna die in a few hours. So that's very clear. But of course, as I'm moving on in my months, I start noticing a difference between my right hand and the breast. This one I control in a much more secure way. The breast sometimes comes, sometimes delays a bit, sometimes doesn't come because she's working, which is a very good thing to happen because that's the base of the subjectivation of the child, right? It's not good that the child doesn't learn that his right hand or left and the breast are not the same, right? But this doesn't come as an easy thing. Also children, when they start to speak, they don't speak in the first person. They speak on the third person, right? Until 2 years old. One child can maybe at 9 months already start to speak. 10, 11, 12, normally, right? But it does it in third person. So the child says, if the child's name is Maria, right? It says, Maria wants that, or the girl wants this, or the daughter, in third person. Why? Well, listen, the first, second person thing is very complicated. When the mother speaks, she says, I, and I is the mother, right? When the father speaks, he says, I, and I is the father. When I speak, I say I, and I is me, but you is the mother. And when the mother speaks, you is me, and she is I. That's very complicated. You cannot just say it's to be picked up like that. It demands a self-consciousness, something that some, Lacan, this psychoanalyst, he spoke a lot about something called the stage of the mirror, and he took from other researchers. He didn't do the research himself, but he's the one that expanded that knowledge the most, and it's the following. A chimpanzee, between 6 and 18 months of age, it has a greater instrumental intelligence than a human child. Because if you give them like something like a cube and a plastic squared hole, and you give them a sphere and a round plastic hole, it takes the sphere and it brings it to the round thing, and it takes the cube and it takes it to the square thing, and it never makes a mistake. That's the chimpanzee. The baby, human baby, it might take the round thing and just try to put it in the square thing or the other way. So instrumental intelligence is not developed. It doesn't develop as quick as the chimpanzee. But the human baby is going to do something between 6 and 18 months that nobody has ever seen a chimpanzee doing. And it's the following. You put a mirror here. Come the chimpanzee and then sees what? Another chimpanzee, right? And wants to play with that one. And just punches and then suddenly sees something cold and not like expected. Huh? But because it's intelligent, it goes behind the mirror. And it's going to look for the chimpanzee behind. And it finds nothing, right? So then it looks puzzled, and then it's done with this. It never, nobody has observed a further development, right? It doesn't know what to do with this. His intelligence, the chimpanzee intelligence, we don't believe it gives this possibility of self-knowledge or reflection. But the baby, also at the beginning, does exactly the same than the chimpanzee. It tries to play with this other boy or girl that sees in the mirror, right? And it just does equally than the chimpanzee. Sometimes they try to go behind, sometimes they get uninterested, until between 6 and 18 months, if the development is the right one, until it comes a moment that this human baby gets it and says, baby, 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 that's me. That's me in the mirror, that's my image. That's a momentous thing. We have no clue how that all happens, but this is a very, very crucial moment, right? Because it is something that you have a sense of your own identity because you see yourself like another. You are like another, right? Others, you know how they look because you have already had experience if you have siblings or other people and you see the mother and maybe the father, but you don't know how you look because even if you have seen your image, you have not understood that's you. So the moment that you identify that you are like that is, says Lacan, a moment of extreme joy because you feel, I'm like the others. Suddenly I'm discovered that I'm like the others, but there is a trick here because you are like the others in appearance. You appear whole like the others, but unlike how the others feel inside that you don't know, but you know of yourself that sometimes you feel disgregated inside, like, for example, you wake up in the morning and you feel horrible, right? Then you go to the mirror and think, oh, okay, not too bad. If I were to look outside how I feel inside, that would be a horrible thing, like in pieces, like. So this is also the basis, according to Lacan, for anxiety, existential anxiety, that I get an appearance to the outside that does not correspond. That's again this freedom that I spoke before, right? The correspondence between what I think and what I do, the correspondence between who am I and how do I present myself in front of others. And here, of course, all applies to the very complexities of the human existential growth and consciousness. So to make it now short, in all this complexity, we are having one human being, which is the mother, as the reference. And according to all these studies, the girl separates from the mother, both girl and boy has to separate from the mother to just get a consciousness, which is the infantile, the child subjectivation, the first subjectivation. And here it's my claim and where I base my feminism. I believe the child subjectivation has gender. I don't believe gender is a femininity, masculinity, it's only cultural. I believe it is cultural, always. But of course, because we are cultural, right? Like even hunger is cultural. Why is hunger cultural? If I am born in a family of people that are poor, I might call hunger something I feel when I have not eaten for 3 days. That I call hunger. If I am in a rich family, after 2 hours I have not eaten, I have hunger. So hunger is cultural, but is it only cultural? Of course not. It doesn't matter in which culture I am born, I'm gonna have something I'll call hunger. And if I don't pay attention, I'm going to die. So it's not only cultural. I believe the masculinity, femininity, and more variants that I might get a chance to talk about, but these two basic understandings of identity are cultural, but not only cultural. But here comes my critique to patriarchy is those identities that are not only cultural and are present in childhood, patriarchy takes them and says those are mandatory for the adult life. We just have a good adult woman when this woman feels and identifies herself and has a subjectivity as an adult woman that is in continuity with the child's subjectivity. And we have a good man when the man adult has a self-identity and a subjectivity in continuity with the child. Am I making sense with what I'm saying? Because I believe patriarchy is not the society that men have built and sustained against women. I believe the patriarchy, because if that were the case, why we women have allowed this? I don't believe that, because I believe that if we women wanted to change it, that would change in 24 hours. We would have a pope that is a woman in 24 hours, if we wanted that, and we would have a society different. I believe in the power of women, right? I don't believe we women are victims. In general, of course, I know very well that a woman can be in a situation of being trapped. Before I was interviewed for the TV, and I explained that in the world today, 800,000 women every year are smuggled in the frontiers from one country to the other into forced prostitution. Of course, I know what it means to take seriously this brutality against women, and I don't want to diminish that. But, and of this, I just give you the numbers, 800,000 every year. And of course, you are smuggled or you are lied into and taken into another country under the promise that you'll be given all the rights, and then you find yourself completely unprotected. You have no rights because you entered the country illegally. And this is happening, half of these 800,000 happen in Europe. And half of these 800,000 are underage every year, right? So that's, of course, happening. But without forgetting this as a society, because women are not only the ones smuggled through the frontier, but also the ones that are prime ministers and the ones that make decisions and the ones that do have real power. And what are we doing with this, all of us? So I believe patriarchy is the society that both men and women have created and sustained. Insofar in the adult life, we continue living the patterns of subjectivation of the childhood. And I have not finished explaining. The pattern of subjectivation of childhood is boy and girl have to separate from the mother, but there are two different strategies for that. The girl separates from the mother and internalizes the lost object of desire, which means I am not one with the mother, but I am like the mother. That's the girl. There are exceptions, and I welcome the exceptions, and I think they are a blessing and very important. So I don't have a problem with exceptions, on the contrary. But I try to make sense of what I told you at the beginning. Why this gender violence, this guilt? Where is it coming from? I try to make sense of patriarchy being a state of affairs that doesn't go away, even if we have feminism now for already more than 100 years in an active political way. So I go back to this. I am not one with my mother. Finally, I get it, that she is you and I understand this. I have a subjectivity, but I am like her. So most, at least in my country, small girls, they like to dress like the mother. They like to comb the hair like the mother. They like to play to be a mother. Is that also here? Like playing, like to be a mother with dolls or whatever. And some girls, you give them a balloon and they paint eyes and mouth and go like with the balloon, not all. And men, they also have to go through this, I am not one with the mother. But if they try, and some men do, some boys do, some already pick it up from the atmosphere and don't even formulate, but some do ask the mother, mother, mommy, when I'll be big, will I be like you? And the mother immediately says, no, my dear, you'll be like daddy. And he's so scared, like, who is daddy? For this internal thing, right? And daddy is not like a triangle. Here's the boy, and here's the mother, and here's the father. Equidistant, of course not, because it's been the pregnancy, and maybe later I have also time to explain some things that go on with this pregnancy. But the father is not another identity that I can internalize, like the girl internalizes the identity of the mother. If that were the case, we would be in the cultural hypothesis. So whatever the mother does is what the girl learns. So if the mother were not the servant of everybody, the girl would not learn to be the servant of everybody. If the father was not the one saying, we're going to do it this way, the boy would not learn. And this, which is the critique of the so-called feminism of difference, I also think it's very important. Of course, the roles of femininity and masculinity as passed on according to what men and women do in a society. But that's not the deepest point. That it's not enough for me to understand why the battered women speak about guilt and the battering men speak about anger. So what I believe it's deeper than that, and does not deny the cultural, but it complements it in a very, for me, crucial way, is that the thing is not that the girl internalizes the mother identity and the boy internalizes the father identity. That's not possible because the object of desire is not the father, is the mother. So there is an asymmetry here that for me it's the foundation of the dichotomy, the gender dichotomy. And it's the following. The girl internalizes the identity of the mother and the boy internalizes the no identity of the mother. That's a different thing because the father, who is the father for the very small boy, is the one who is not the mother. It's not a direct relationship. So what it means is for a girl and for an adult woman that still goes according to the childhood, I will feel myself, I will feel fulfilled, I will feel things are going the right way when I am in agreement with those who I love. So for an adult woman, normally it's not threatening to find out that the lover, be it man or woman, but I'll do it with men now, that the man you love, you say, oh, I love to go to the beach. And he says, I love it too. Oh, how nice. And I love it too. Oh, how nice. And the woman is all excited and all happy about it and doesn't feel threatened about it. Well, what happened to the man? It's a bit different, right? He might be all happy that they have one coincidence. But if they have two, that's okay. But if they have 3 or 4, he is going to start to get a bit nervous. Because his childhood is not because the man is more independent. This is bullshit, right? I don't believe in that. But because I believe the identity of the child, the boy, it's based on a lack of identity. And so it's both are equally to be transcended, both are equally childhood things, but they are very different. If you have learned to be yourself, the first time you have said, I am, you have said it in continuity with the one you love, which is the mother, right? So then you feel continuity is not threatening, it's the normal thing. That's why some adult women in patriarchy, you ask them, who are you? And they answer, I'm the daughter of, I'm the mother of, I'm the sister of, I'm the wife of. But not with who are you in yourself, because the patriarchal women, not all women, but the patriarchal women have a sense of alone, I'm nobody. That's very well studied, right? This sense of lack of identity of women in patriarchy when they are considered alone, so that they get a sense of being somebody when you are taking care of others, which is, of course, reproducing this mother thing. For the man, that can be a man that loves his family very much, but if you ask him, what did you do this summer? He must say, I went to Italy. And maybe he went to Italy with the whole family. But you ask him what he did, right? So he doesn't feel necessarily compelled to answer, the whole family went to Italy. He might answer to you, I went to Italy. Because has a sense of this distinction is what might make him, the patriarchal man, comfortable. Am I making sense with this? Okay, if that is in some way true or makes sense, I think that is what it needs to be addressed in education, not change from the beginning. I don't think this can be or should be, or we need to change it as a childhood experience. I think this has to do with this mother role, and I think in itself, in the childhood, is not threatening, and there is no problem with it. The problem comes when in the adult life, we keep on like that. And here I quote, and I will be finishing with that, the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John, which is an encounter between a wise man of Jesus' time, the 1st century Palestine. It's called Nicodemus, and he is like a scribe, so somebody that was regarded as a very cultivated person, and Jesus. And this very, like as if he were like a professor at the university or something similar, does not want to be seen with this marginal rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth. So the text, if you review that 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John, you'll find that the text says, Nicodemus went to find Jesus at night, which is not to be seen. They talked to each other about this human fulfillment, right? This getting to fulfill the will of God and being a person that really brings his or her own life to maturity. And Jesus tells Nicodemus, you know, Nicodemus, you have to be born again. And Nicodemus says, how can that be? How can an adult man go back into the uterus of a woman and be born again, right? And Jesus says, no, not from a woman, from water and the Spirit. And then goes on and says, the Spirit that blows wherever it wants, and nobody knows where it comes from, nobody knows where it goes. So Nicodemus is all puzzled and just leaves, and that finishes the conversation. But what I take this conversation to speak of something called queer, that you might be familiar with the word queer. I have written a book in Italian called Queer Theology, or Towards a Queer Theology, and what I mean by that is the word queer was, in English, it means like strange or rare, right? It is a word that also in German, there is the word queren, the verb, that means to cross, right? It's like, in English they say straight. A person straight is heterosexual, right? Straight in a line that goes all secure to the goal. And then queer, which is somebody that it's deviated, right? It has gone, something has gone wrong and it's not a straight. That's in English, right? To be used as an insult for homosexual people, queer. They were being insulted with that word queer in the 90s. And some of the activists of these homosexual British groups took the word and say, okay, you are throwing us the word at us because you are saying that we don't fit in your categories, right? Because the categories are maleness, femaleness, and complementarity between the two. And you're right, we don't fit. But wait a minute, it's only us who don't fit? Or isn't it that it's all of us that don't fit in any pre-established category? What it is to grow as a human being, what it is to have your adult identity as something that is originality, that it's a unique piece. Is that, and I believe the sight of God on each one of us is not looking and seeing male and female, black and white, and Serbian and Croats, and I don't believe that. I believe, and I have many quotes also from the Bible to support this, that God is looking at each of us and seeing a unique human being, and seeing a unique and original concretization in time and space of the love and the freedom of God. And I believe that is what the ancient tradition of theology calls divinization, and what the letter to the Galatians in the New Testament says, in Christ Jesus there is no Lord and serf, there is no Greek and Jew, there is no male and female. Why does it say that? What does it mean there is no male and female? Well, it means male and female exist, Jew and Greek or Serb and Croat exist, but please do not hang your identity on that. My identity as an adult person, as a free person, as a loving person, is in a space that's beyond that. And I will never be able to get rid of this. But one thing is to get rid of it, which is impossible, my body and my experience. And another is to let this rule my life, to let this be my box, that this queer is going to break through, to let this be my horizon of realization, and to let this be the principle of organizing my society. So I believe this call of freedom that the existentialists, right, all the philosophers from Sartre and are talking about is like, dare to be yourself. And when we do that, it's always a threatening thing, it's a risky thing. You move into an area that is absolutely beyond any stereotype. The people I admire the most, that are maybe old people, that are women and men that inspire me to something beautiful. I believe, okay, if you can be 90 years old and be like this, life is worth it to experience. They are not stereotypical male and females. They are women that have come to old age and they have a sense of entitlement to who they are, right? They have like a way of speaking that I admire, because I think, okay, she's not like looking for applause and she's not looking for like others to continue. She's just going her way in a gentle way, but very free in that sense, right? And male that are also old and able to inspire me, and also not the stereotypical males, but old men that are able to show all their tenderness and vulnerability without being afraid of losing the maleness. And still one more thing, in the church we have people we call saints, right? And saints are inspiring figures that the church believes that are inspired by God. Okay, maybe you have heard of a saint called Saint Joan of Arc. Okay, what is God doing? Inspiring her to do what? To just go into the battle and be a warrior? That doesn't seem to be a fulfillment of the femininity, by no means. But we believe Joan of Arc was inspired by God. So if God was into the business of male and female stereotypes, he would inspire all the women saints to be perfectly female, right? And to do all the feminine things. And all the males, okay, you've heard maybe about Francis of Assisi, right? He's jumping in the fields and calling the flowers sisters. And okay, it doesn't look like a stereotypical male to me, right? But it's a wonderful saint that the church honors and that it has inspired so many people. So whenever I see a free person, it doesn't matter male, female, that is able to inspire others, I see somebody that is able to move beyond the stereotypes. And that's why I believe the patriarchal society, it's something that will always have with us, but we can have it in a way that it doesn't rule us, not the patriarchal society. Let me take that back. This need to not fall into the patriarchal relationships in the family, in the society, this danger or this possibility will always be there, not the society, that somebody erases, I don't know if somebody is, but please let me correct that, right? Not the society. The possibility will always be there, like the possibility of abusing freedom is always there, the possibility of violence is always there. Let's be realistic. There is no, and that I can link with something Maia said. Remember to say that when she has heard from other conference I do, I quote this idea that comes from Trotsky of the permanent revolution, right? That revolution can be also an alienating enterprise when we believe that once we get it, then we'll be done, right? And once we get rid of our president, which I wish you do, everything, for example, then everything, like, everything will be solved. Of course not, right? You know that. But when we were able to call our country, I don't know, like cooperativist or whatever each of you likes, then we'll be finally okay. No, there is not such finally okay. But this is not to discourage anybody to do demonstrations. It's just to encourage that we devise and come together to think of ways that we can keep these counterbalances and that we never let this popular power, the people powers, be delegated on anybody, because we need to keep it in our hands and we need to find ways to articulate that in a very effective way. And the same with the private, intimate situation is not to be stressed all day, but you have to be active, ready to think, okay, there is a fallback identity, which is my childhood identity, and that's not evil, it's not bad in a child, but in an adult. If I fall back in my childhood identity, I'll be a woman that feels guilty when she doesn't take care of the people around. Because that's my childhood identity with the mother. The mother was taking care of the children, the father also, but I already explained. That's not to say the father should not take care, of course. And this is very good, and it's helping this subjectivity to grow in an open, more open way. But this role of the mother as an object of desire, father cannot substitute. So if I fall back into my childhood identity, I'll be an adult woman that will be fearful of solitude, which is the right name for the patriarchal love. When patriarchy says women know better than men how to love, women are more loving than men, women are more able to sacrifice than men. This, I believe, it's wrong wording, it's misnomers. What is true in patriarchy is women are more afraid of solitude than men, usually. And men are more free also. I think this is wrong, it's not true. I believe men are more afraid of dependency than women. But the fear of dependency is not freedom, it's fear of dependency. The fear of solitude is not love, it's fear of solitude. And when you bring together the fear of solitude and the fear of dependency, you have the heterosexual patriarchal couple. And it's a disaster, as we all know. And so this is the idea, is that this, I don't look in others and think, all these all these heteropatriarchal couples and what they do, and that I have a sense. I don't think that is going to hurt me. On the contrary, that I have a sense that this is a fallback identity, possible always, and that is a responsibility of us all together to grow in our spaces of inner silence and prayer or meditation, however you want to do it, in our interaction with others, in the awareness that that is a possibility, and also knowing that this will happen whenever your life is going into a situation that is a bit overwhelming for you, falling back to these identities. And so with that I finish now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tereza. I have a lot of questions, but as we do not have a lot of time, I would only pose one, and then I would really give a chance for the audience to pose questions. So my first question would be, because you finished your lecture with the idea of permanent revolution, and you are also not just a Benedictine nun, you're also very active now in the political fight, in a leftist political fight in Catalonia, and you're part and founder of the Procés Constituent. And I wanted to read some of these manifesto motives, but I also don't think we have a lot of time. So I want you just to tell us something about your practical work in the field of the revolution that you're doing, and why are you for the independence of Catalonia? As we know, it's not a nationalistic thing, it's more an organizational thing and more like a social revolution that you're trying to get there. So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Maja very nicely is saying, well, she's for the independent, but she's not nationalist, because I know that if I say here I'm nationalist, then this will be disaster like happened to me in Berlin, because when I use the word nationalist, but I use it in a way that you might think it's similar to how they use it in Latin America, like these countries that have been colonized and the countries that have known what it is to have this uprootedness of what their language is forbidden, like my grandfather was in jail because he spoke Catalan, right? And this is something I believe, let me just go briefly here and then, I believe it's happening with globalization, which I hate, which is called uniformization, right? Before it didn't happen, you went to certain cities. I went more than 25 years ago to Vienna, and I remember, I had a remembrance of Vienna as very different from my own city, right? I went recently to Vienna, and it's like, huh? What happened here? Mango, Starbucks, and I don't know, Zara, and everything. It's like McDonald's, of course, and that's in Barcelona, the same thing. In Berlin, the same thing, right? So this uniformization, I believe that it's very important to be able to oppose, and to oppose in a way that for me has nothing to do with chauvinism, which of course I'm completely against, to think some cultures are better than others. This is completely ridiculous. And of course, xenophobia, right? To think, no, I want to expel the different. I already said it during my lecture, right? This is the unfree society. So then what kind of nationalism is left if you leave xenophobia away and you leave chauvinism away? So that's something that also this author, Simone Weil, or maybe one poet, a Catalan poet called Salvador Espriu, they just say, well, it's like you love your country because you know better its infamous it's called, so its defects, its shortcomings, is like, that's a way that these two thinkers talk about it. But for me, it's a matter of having a democracy that it is at a lower, at a smaller political unit. So that means in Catalonia right now we are part of this country, Spain, and during the fascist regime in Spain, Galicia, which has its own language, it's in the north of Spain, Basques, which are also in the north of Spain, and Catalans. They were all forbidden to speak their own language, and they were persecuted, and they were treated in a way that caused a resistance, of course, of the people against fascism. But it was a resistance against fascism that was mixed with this idea of having their independence politically. And that happens also in another country, which is Ireland, that you might know the Communist Party in Ireland is nationalist. It's from James Connolly. James Connolly was killed at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was killed because it was the first one who knew, well, he was not the first one maybe, but he was defending this idea of avoiding the, having the political power every time more far away from the people that are to be ruled by it. And I said before, I like that the political power is at the level of the people. So that being said, my process constituent and what we do in this movement, it's called constituent process because it's precisely about changing the constitution, right? Having a new constitution. And that's because what we have as our framework for our social organization, our constitution in Spain, it's already impossible. Within that frame, it's impossible to try to move the society towards a major social justice. We could reform the constitution, but to reform the constitution, you need 2/3 of the Spanish parliament, and this, it doesn't seem to be happening. In Catalonia, there is the possibility today to have, to move towards a direction of greater social justice. And I would like that to happen because I think what I would love for the future is some federation, confederation, so I don't believe and I don't like isolated political units that are autarkic and only think of themselves. That's ridiculous. We are truly in a globalized moment and we have an interdependence that is growing, right? But the interdependence, I want it from equal to equal, not from somebody imposing conditions on others, like it's happening now in Europe with the north of Europe and the south of Europe. We know about the euro, right? You don't have the euro here, you have dinar, right?
Dinner.
Okay, so as you know, right, when the euro was, many economies from the south, the leftist ones were saying, don't do that, right? This is going to be exactly what happened. It's neo-colonialism. What we are having is an impossibility to run your own economy in the country, an impossibility to have sovereignty, right, to be able to be responsible for the decision. So in this context, the possibility that in Catalonia we move towards an independent state that will mean that we have to write a new constitution from scratch, right? And this possibility of writing a new constitution, I and many others, right? We started with 40 activists and we grew a movement of, we were 47,000, but active we are much less now because that's complicated to keep going. But that's a movement that what it tries to do is some of the things I've been spoken, for example, I didn't say it today, but private property. Am I against private property? Do I think we should abolish all private property? Well, as a nun, I don't have any private property. I live with 30 other nuns, I already said it, and we all have given up private property, and I advise you all to do the same thing. Not to become a nun, but to just try these other ways of having ownership. Because for me, it's a very precious thing, but I would never back up a state that would force the people to give up all property, because precisely it's a precious thing. I don't think it can be forced on anybody. But one thing is to ban forcefully from the state all private property. I'm against that. And another thing is to limit private property. I'm in favor of that. I don't think the private property is an absolute right. I think it's a conditioned right. And in that, I'm together with the so-called social magisterium of the Church. The Catholic Church says that private property is illegitimate. You are not allowed to hold it if your accumulation makes other people go without. If you have all the bread with you and somebody's not eating, you are a thief. That's what the theologian from the 1st century said. So this thing, when you explain it to people or you discuss it with many people, the majority of people, at least in Catalonia, they say, okay, it makes sense. We want to go like that. Okay, but who is going to put this in the Constitution? That's why we did the movement, to put this in the Constitution.
Are you just a movement or is it now a political party? And what do you think about movements becoming political parties, as I am aware that you're not for parliamentary democracy, but still in the current situation?
We're registered as a political party because maybe some of you know that the party of Ada Colau that is the mayor of Barcelona now, they at the beginning, their name was Guanyem Barcelona. This is, we will win Barcelona. But because they did not inscribe themselves as a political party, a right-winger took the name. And then they had to change the name, right? So in our movement, we inscribed ourselves right away as a political party so that nobody could take the name. And also, we are ready to go into the elections. That's why I am temporarily not living permanently in the monastery, because I could be ready to run for the elections. But that would be to go into constitutional elections. That is, to elect the assembly that is going to draft the new constitution. So in that sense, we are ready to go into the elections, but for us as a movement, the most important thing is, of course, not, and I don't think also in Serbia, it's very important that social-political movements do not get absorbed completely into the institutionalization, right? Do you need people ready to go into the institutions and change it? Of course. Otherwise, how are you going to do it, right? But the most important is not the ones that are going to go into the institution. The most important is if you achieve here, and we achieve in Catalonia and everywhere, that we don't lose the link between those who go to the institution and those who remain at the non-institutionalized but politically activated population. So sometimes people say you have to have one leg in the institution and one leg in the street, right? But no, that's not right. You have to have one leg in the institution and 1,000 legs in the street, because otherwise it just sucks you, right? And this is not only for now that we are trying to change things in my country or here, but especially important for me would be that Catalonia would be the first country in the world, and if it's the second, I'm happy because it means somebody else did it first, so it's not a competition thing, but I'm saying the first because unfortunately there is none that has it. The first country in the world able to articulate in the new constitution an effective counter-popular power for the democracy. We have now mostly these representative democracies. That's insufficient, clearly insufficient. We have people to whom we, parliamentarians or people in the government, in the minister, we have power, the popular power, and we are giving it to them, voting them, right? And once we have voted, we are left with nothing. I don't know in Serbia if you have those counter, but we are left with nothing. We just have to wait 4 years and then, or go to the streets and then claim the power again, right? But officially, we are left with nothing. And we just have to hope and pray that they do whatever they promise in the elections, which they don't do, right? And then in the next election, you punish the one you voted first, you voted another one, and that other one does the same thing. When it's in power, says, well, what I said in the campaign, now we'll do it later. And that's very frustrating. And so in my country, 60% go to vote, not more. How many go here?
55.
Okay, so what is this? You cannot call democracy that. Some people, sorry that they go a bit long, but just some people think today, you have democracy when you can vote, right? Well, no, that's not true. I believe you could have democracy even not voting, but not to make it so polemical. Let's say, okay, you need the vote to have democracy, but you need to do something before voting and something after voting. And if you don't do the something before and the something after, the act of voting, it's a fake. It's false. It's a joke. It's worse than a joke. It's like it's a demeaning thing. What's the thing before the voting? The thing before voting is the most important. It's called deliberation, right? And deliberation, it's not that some politician comes and tells you how it's going to be. Deliberation means that you take seriously the political subjectivity of your neighbor. Deliberation means that you have platforms, you have places, you have an organization that demands people to share the political ideas, and that people that have different ideas, those who think different, they have a platform to be able to express themselves. This is a little bit similar, the most closed example, so you don't think I'm just talking things that are not real. Maybe, have you had in Serbia cities doing the participatory budgets? But you've heard about this, right? Like cities that instead of saying you've voted the city council, right? So they are going to decide what the budget should be. That's how it has worked in many countries and many cities. But many cities lately are doing participatory budget. That means that, okay, you are the elected representative, but that doesn't mean you have all the power and you know everything better. So you are going to establish mechanisms to have discussions in the people in your city to see how better to draft the budget. So that you keep people not burdened with political activities activation that makes no sense. But you have a sense, that's again this constant revolution or permanent revolution, you have a sense of co-responsibility. And this is something that, the fact that may scare us, or we might think, oh, this is not going to work, this is alienation, I believe, already. Because we know for sure that giving all the power to 4 politicians doesn't work. Do we need more examples for that? Do we need to wait longer to know that this is a disaster and it's bringing the world to disaster? I'm not claiming that having this more horizontal, participatory, deliberative democracy, it's easy. Of course it's not easy, but it is the only way, I know, to make a significant advance in social justice. And so our movement are completely for that. And the thing I had to tell you also, the thing after, right? So deliberation, to make it very simply, is if somebody comes to me and tells me, here we have a vaccine, right? This vaccine is very effective, completely effective, and has no side effects. And now you, with your sovereign freedom, you decide, do you want it or not? With my sovereign freedom, which is what we do when we vote, right? Say, of course I want it, of course, because the information you're giving me is, depending on that information, I will decide one thing or the other. So who controls the information? It's not about voting. If before voting they have told me the TTIP, the free trade agreement, is wonderful, it's going to bring jobs in my country and has no problem, let's do a referendum in Serbia. Maybe you all say yes to that, or let's do it somewhere else, right? But where are these information that is different coming from? This is, I think, the key issue. And I said, after voting, so if you really had good deliberations and then you could vote freely, then yes, right, you have democracy. No, still you need something else. You can have a very good deliberation and you can have a vote that gives some power to a political representative, and you need something else after the vote, which is called revocatory capacity. It's to take back the thing if it's not worked. It's to expel the politician. Like now you're doing demonstrations because you don't have something called revocatory referendum, right? Popular. You don't have it because otherwise you would just call it. We don't have it either. That means in some countries, if 1% of the population opposes like the way a politician is doing his or her work, that is enough not to impose what the 1% want on the 99, of course not. But the 1% that is more conscious or more organized is enough to force a referendum. And that referendum that happened to Chavez, for example, in Venezuela, right? They wanted to make a different society. I know they have many problems. I've been 4 times invited there, and I have many more positive things to say that maybe the press is telling you here or in Spain, for example. But of course, the problems are real, and I also acknowledge them. But they did something which is called revocatory popular referendum, which meant if a percentage of the population, it was not 1%, but 15% in the case of Chavez, 15% organized to oppose the president of a country, you were forced to have a referendum. And then if the majority didn't want the president goes. Even if you had elected the president 2 months ago, it doesn't matter. You don't lose your popular power. That's what it's a joke with our democracies, representative democracies. They shouldn't be called democracy because we completely give up the power. And the only thing we can do is vote, and after this vote, get frustrated. And this is what I believe, well, what in our movement we want to change. And with a new constitution and a new country, we could change it, but if you have enough mobilization to force a change, a revision of your constitution, then of course you don't need a new country to do it. But we might need a new country because we have now a situation in Spain where, as you know, this extreme right-wing party just keeps winning the general elections in Spain. But if you do the polls in Catalonia, the left are winning. So that's a situation that I believe it's good to move ahead with the independence, not only for us and forget about everybody else. It's good for everybody. My friends who are in the rest of Spain are saying, I wish so much that you keep going with this because this will have effects for all of us, right? That will be forced to move ahead also.
Thank you, Sister Teresa.